Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. Today's video is a bit of an odd one. It's about world building and the Malazan world and how important it is, and it's related to magic, but it's actually an old academic paper that I gave, or at least a version of it, because I can't find the original, and I can't find the original PowerPoint either, which would have been a lot of fun because I had slides, I had little quotations, I had pictures. But I have access to one version of it, so I thought I would do it now. So you'll have to forgive me. I am actually going to read this, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. And it was an old paper I gave called Worldbuilding and the Malazan Book of the Feminist. At the heart of a significant proportion of fantasy is the diegetic reality, the setting itself, the diegesis, or the story world. And it's one of those things that often sets fantasy apart from other forms of literature, those stories that use the real world as the foundational basis for the setting of the narrative. Fantasy, like a lot of science fiction and horror, creates a new reality in which the narrative resides. So where Dickens, Austen, the Brontes set their work in a contemporaneous, if fictionalized England, the settings of their works did not need to be invented, as they simply lifted complete societies, customs, economics, races, prejudices and biases from England, from the real world. And not only that, their diegetic story world did not have to be fundamentally altered or disguised. It could be a fairly accurate depiction of the real world. They could pretty much copy wholesale from what was outside their window. And lastly, the setting would be immediately familiar to their readers because it wasn't invented. No such shortcut really exists for secondary fantasy worlds. Fantasy authors may borrow from the real world, they may borrow from other fantasy worlds, and a great many borrow from history. But they must combine these elements into a fictive world that does not and could not exist in our universe, at least as we understand it. From Tolkien's Middle-earth and Donaldson's The Land to modern fantasies by Mieville, Sanderson, Robin Hobb, the range and style of fantasy worlds seems limited only by the breadth of the author's imagination, the intent with which they have created it, and their ability to make it real to a reader. But as these settings will be new to a reader, a great deal of information must be conveyed in order to situate the narrative in an understandable environment, in contrast to authors of mimetic fiction, who can assume their readers already know and already understand the fictive reality they are being presented with. But rather than being a simple background to story, fantasy settings can be complex characters in and of themselves. And modern fantasy continues this trend by producing even greater numbers of increasingly complex and increasingly inventive worlds that are fundamentally linked to the stories being told. These realms and settings have an enormous impact on the narratives constructed in them and with them. And these settings can be exceptionally revealing about authorial intent and conceptual bias in the narrative. The fact that fans of fantasy frequently discuss the world building as a fundamental part of what they enjoy about fantasy stories, in addition to character, story, and plot, and all the other aspects of narratives that draw us to them, world building, the fictive realities created, are clearly an important aspect of this type of writing, of this genre. So in the study of games, particularly role-playing games and computer games, the concept of world building is both well established and well respected due to the immersive focus of those media and the need to program and codify a multitude of defined parameters within the ludic narrative environments to create an explorable and discoverable virtual story world. But when it comes to academic criticism of fantasy literature, world building is not necessarily so well defined, nor is it necessarily given the same focus and attention that I feel it deserves. In traditional literary criticism, attention can be paid to setting and how it relates to potential prejudice, bias, or privilege within the author's writing. And nary an eyebrow would be raised. So, for example, in Bronte's Jane Eyre, all the references to her inheritance, the money from the Caribbean estate, as well as the treatment of Bertha Mason, leads to a very interesting reading of the colonial aspect of Jane Eyre, something that's glossed over in the narrative. But the implications of slavery, plantations, and colonial privilege are woven directly into that diegetic reality. Mad Woman in the Attic is a result of a post-colonial reading of exactly the same thing. But the critical view of world building and fantasy is not always portrayed this way. While some dismiss the authorial and fan attention to world building and fantasy as an encyclopedic impulse, as if it is somehow less important than character and story and theme, even though in some of the best and most popular modern fantasy, the setting, just as with mimetic fiction, it can reveal so much about the work's other aspects. And this brings me to my first set of points on this. While it is clear that fantasy worlds are invented and are also products of the author's imagination, a great many share common aspects. And this is the closest we really get to a shortcut in world building. The idea of established concepts or tropes or cliches or generic aspects of a fantasy world. And these are often reductive or simplistic or interchangeable narrative modules that can be transposed almost wholesale from one fantasy world to another. Modern fantasy authors often use, abuse, invert, subvert, write against, or write with these recognizable aspects. There are plenty of fantasy worlds in which there is a Roman-based realm, or an ancient Greek land, or an ancient Egyptian setting. And hands up if you've ever come across the ever popular pseudo-medieval Western European setting in a fantasy world. I am sure we are all familiar with terms like extruded fantasy product, or derivative fantasy land, a thought-free setting, or formulaic, to describe something that is almost instantly recognizable as a fantasy world. But curiously, we never seem to have quite the same urge to sneer at the derivative setting of yet another book set in London, or in New York, or in that quaint English countryside village. So clearly, the setting of fantasy worlds is important because we expect them to be inventive, and we criticize those that are not inventive enough. But there is something of a double standard, as at the same time, we are quite happy to let setting slide as important in a lot of mimetic fiction. But there's a curious exception to this general approach. If a fantasy author takes a story from the real world and dresses it up a little in fantasy drag, they are often praised for their innovative approach, even though their setting, the story, all of the characters are derived explicitly from an historical source. And I certainly wouldn't mention Guy Gavriel Kay and George R. R. Martin in relation to that. But coincidentally, talking about Martin, Martin was interviewed by Entertainment Weekly, and this was quite some time ago, obviously. And he had said that most fantasy stories depict the Disneyland Middle Ages. And he finished the interview by saying, "I want to portray struggle. Drama comes out of conflict. If you portray a utopia, then you probably wrote a pretty boring book." And I think one of the other things he said is, if you're going to write about war and you just want to include all the cool battles and heroes killing a lot of orcs and things like that, you don't portray, I think he was referring to sexual violence, there's something fundamentally dishonest about that. There are a lot of questionable things about Martin's perspective on what he chooses to and what he chooses not to portray in A Song of Ice and Fire. And it's a complex and nuanced discussion, and I'm not getting into it here. But his essential point of, can you write an epic fantasy story that has grit, that would investigate the darkest aspects of the human condition, that depicted violence and horror and the terrible nature of war? And I went, I know a couple of series like that. One of them being the Malazan Book of the Fallen, Stephen Erickson's series. But not only that, the Malazan Book of the Fallen has gender parity. And dragons, very important. I do freely admit, however, it isn't a utopia. And the reason I bring this all up in relation to world building is that Erikson, along with Erikson and Esslemont, the world's co-creator and a co-writer in the world, they managed this feat through their world building, their approach to world building. And in fact, their approach to world building would be very familiar to science fiction scholars and authors. It's that extrapolative mode, or the extrapolative model, or what we commonly refer to as the what if approach. Over the course of several interviews, both Erikson and Esslemont have spoken extensively about the fact that they gamed the world first. It began as a D&D campaign world before they adapted it to a more flexible GURP system. And they began with these very generic elements that we associate with D&D. They drew on established tropes, and they built out a GURP system. And then they moved beyond that. Part of what they worked out through the gaming, through the development of their campaigns and this development of their game world, aided by their training as anthropologists and archaeologists, were some of the sociological impacts of their world building decisions. And one of the fundamental aspects of the world and how they extrapolated the ramifications. And that aspect, this extrapolation of ramifications, this integration of something into the story world, this is the thing that I am finding interesting enough to make you listen to this. Because it's what they did with the magic system, or more accurately, what the magic system meant in terms of world building. So when creating the magic system, and more importantly, the impact of the magic system, both Erikson and Esslemont hit upon an easy way to make their world both definitively an epic, gritty fantasy world, but also feminist, gender equal, gender parity. Magic could be learned by anyone. There might be savants and geniuses and adepts, but anyone could theoretically learn magic. And as a result, magic was essentially egalitarian. From the smallest village to the largest cities, magic was everywhere, and it was part of all of these different cultures across the world. And this one simple concept, that magic is actually part of the world's system of evolution, seems so straightforward, so obvious, but it's surprisingly absent from a lot of fantasy settings. Their magic system was not demarcated along gender lines like Jordan's Wheel of Time or Good Consort of Truth. The magic of the Malazan world can be harnessed by almost anyone. It just required work, dedication, and time to hone the talent, and also someone to teach you. And magic could be exceptionally powerful. It could be a unifier, or at the very least, a leveler of the playing field. If male and female magic users have access to exactly the same power, there is one less reason to treat them differently in society, in the culture, in the workplace, in the home. But perhaps most importantly, healing magic was no longer simply the provenance of rulers, nobles, and adventurers, as we so commonly find in fantasy series. The majority of the residents of the Malazan world have access to some healing magics, such as Denel, High Denel, and all the derivations thereof. Now, admittedly, not equal access. Wasn't always available at the same rate. It wasn't always available at the same level. But there are plenty of hedge wizards and witches, minor talents, minor healers, aplenty across the entire world that could utilize various forms and aspects and strengths of healing magics. So Erikson and Esslemont extrapolated from this. People lived longer, barring a knife in the back or a sword in the gut or, a giant undead monster jumping on your head. But both men and women lived longer. They remained fertile longer. Infant mortality rates were dramatically lowered because magic could be used to cure childhood diseases. And this leads to a significant sociological change. Birth rates dropping because people no longer felt the need to have lots of children in order that only a few would survive. Because they had far fewer children, lived far longer, this meant that women were no longer confined to the home as housewives and mothers. They weren't confined to this role as baby factories producing the next generation of epic soldier. Their society never evolved to the point where this became the dominant view of the role and function of women in that society. So as a direct result of magic, in particular, the healing magic, and incorporating it into the fabric of the world, women were almost completely emancipated in this story world. In the first book of Gardens of the Moon, the Malazan Empire is led by the Empress Lucine. The first magic user the reader is introduced to is a witch. The most powerful mage to be given significant page time is also a woman. And none of them are presented as exceptions in the world. They are normal. They are the norm. Both Erikson and Esslemont in their novels have a variety of important female characters, ranging from the Empress, senior political and military officers, assassins, mages, thieves, sea captains, soldiers, and marines. In fact, it's easier to simply say that there are no occupations in the Malazan world that easily spring to mind that are solely the purview of only one gender. But much of this is not explicitly stated or spelled out in the books themselves. The rationale and the reasoning behind their decisions are intrinsically tied up in the world building. Erikson has said that this gender equality was an intentional aspect of the world that he and Esslemont built. It was a fundamental goal of their world building. And because the world has gender parity, none of the characters within the world point it out or question it. And as a result, it is an aspect of the series that is often overlooked, along with the fact that the vast majority of the characters do not come from Northern Hemisphere, pseudo-European, pseudo-Viking, pseudo-Anglo, pseudo-Irish. The majority, or at least a significant majority, of the Malazan world are populated by characters who are not white. Because Erikson and Esslemont took a gaming approach to developing their world, they utilized their gamers' encyclopedic impulses and used them to create a science fictional what-if scenario in a fantasy world from generic, established, derivative building blocks. They created an innovative, challenging, rationalized, rational fantasy world. Their fantasy is feminist because they established gender parity as a natural norm. And as a result, their world is a fascinating examination of functioning feminist storytelling and an investigation of colonial and post-colonial practices from multiple perspectives. The hardest thing to believe about the Malazan world is not the dragons, but the fact that so few people seem aware of the subversive politics of this fantasy world. So that was a paper I gave at an academic conference. You can tell it's a little old, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please, leave a comment in the comment section. And I will see you in the next one.